You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome to this week's episode of People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Sarah Backer. In 2022, 1 in 8 households in the United States experience food insecurity or lack of access to an affordable and nutritious diet. Development impacts who has access to fresh and nutritious food, where food is grown, how far food must travel before it is consumed, and where food distributors and retailers are placed. The new book, Remarkable Cities and the Security and Sovereignty of Food and Nutrition, offers recommendations for how to make development sustainable in order to foster healthier and more food sovereign and secure communities. Today I have the pleasure of speaking to the author, Jonathan Rosenblum, who is also a professor at Albany Law School and the founding director of the Sustainable Development Code, which offers best practices for community development. Welcome, Jonathan.
Well, it's great to be here, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
To start, can you tell us a little bit about the state of the food system in the U.S.?
There's a number of ways to look at the food system in the United States, but some of the things that we were looking at to really come about with the idea for this book concerned rates of malnutrition, rates of anemia, obesity, heart disease, and what the connection between that is and local laws.
Thanks, Jonathan. So your book lays out ways to amend development codes in order to address some of the concerns that you just mentioned. Can you help us break down the role that development plays in shaping the food system?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. When we think about the current state of the food system, it's hard not to also think about the environmental impacts it has and the effects on equity it has. So when we think about the role that development codes can play in this, it is important to think about how we develop the land, not only today and tomorrow, but the way that we've developed land over the past 100 years or so since zoning really became the predominant way to regulate land in the U.S. And what we see when we dive into zoning codes from the past is that they have structured land in a way that, number one, has a very significant impact on biodiversity. It has a very significant impact on ecosystems and the quality of the health of the environment generally. And then number two, associated with that, it also has a very significant impact on equity. And so when we look at where do we find food deserts, where do we find food swamps, where do we find areas defined as food apartheid, typically, what we find is that they are located in poor areas and areas of people predominantly of color. And so the way that we have structured the land use has these impacts on the environment as well as society. And so rethinking that portion of it, to be very clear, what we're doing in this book is taking on a very small piece of a very large system. The food system is impacted by international laws, national laws, state laws. We are focusing solely on the local laws and specifically not any local law, but zoning and development law. Addressing something like food security and sovereignty cannot be done in a single kind of motion, but it's rather a much larger movement that needs to address all different aspects of a variety of systems that were designed to either oppress people or benefit people in terms of an economy. But this piece is just one little cog in that larger system, but it's an important cog and one that's undervalued.
Just so our listeners who are less familiar can have a clearer picture, can you provide some examples of ways that zoning and development law hinder or can improve food and nutrition, security, and sovereignty?
This question is really hard because this stuff is really granular. Really down into the weeds. And so there are 41 examples in the book, and they're all like, hey, we got rid of our provision that prohibited bees.
Please do get into it. We like to get granular on this podcast.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that to get into it, it's important to understand why we have this project to begin with. On one hand, it's a direct response to the food issues we were discussing earlier. It is also a direct response to the notion that there are thousands of local governments facing very similar challenges. There's over 36,000 local governments that have the power to control land use in the United States. Not all of them are facing the same challenges because they're very diverse, but many of them are. And so it's inefficient and expensive for each local government to reinvent solutions to the very similar challenges. And so this book and the Sustainable Development Code more generally are designed to help local governments take advantage of their collective knowledge and experience. And so what we try to do is share innovative approaches that local governments are taking to address zoning and development codes. Because as part of that, many of these zoning codes have a base code that is 50 years, 60 years, even 70 years old. I mean, even some that are 30 years old are problematic. Now, certainly they've all been amended ad hoc as time moves on, but the base code itself is decades old. And that becomes very problematic when we think about all of the new information that we have concerning the environment, concerning equity, concerning the food system. And so with this project, we are looking at development and zoning through the lens of food security and sovereignty. And so we do an analysis of the development process from soup to nuts and try to identify where in that process food security and sovereignty is implicated. And then we make amendments to that. And so there's a bunch of different ways to look at this, but just a very straightforward example might be to think about where do we prohibit the production of a variety of forms of food, whether it's prohibit fruit trees or prohibit people from having chickens or fowl or bees, and rethinking the way that the zoning code allows people to produce food on their own property. But that's only one aspect of this. And again, I'm glad to dive into more ways to think about zoning and development and food security and sovereignty.
So, Jonathan, this book is the second in a series under the Sustainable Development Code project. Can you tell us more about this project and how it started?
We had an interdisciplinary group come together about 15 years ago. These were architects, lawyers, planners, city staff, economists, biologists from around the country to try to figure out how can we rethink development? Because development has such significant impacts on the environment and equity. And so we identified 36 areas where the development code impacts sustainability. And they are things like climate change, wildlife and biodiversity, food system and security, social equity, environmental justice, and others. And then we look at the development code and process through the lens of those individual 36 areas. So for example, this is looking at the development code through the lens of food security and sovereignty. The first book was looking at the development code through the lens of climate mitigation. They're really just designed to get that information out there so that local governments can begin that process of changing their codes to address these issues.
Thank you for that explanation. Would you mind just stepping back and explaining the process of how local governments make amendments to zoning and development codes?
Typically, a local government will go through a zoning rewrite process. That's an expensive endeavor. It is a difficult endeavor, and it's a time-intensive endeavor. And so local governments rarely do it, particularly local governments that are small. I mean, you might have like a city like Austin, Boston, New York, San Francisco. They may go through that process every 10 years, 15 years or something like that. But most local governments don't have the resources to do it regularly. So what that means is that that base code that was drafted 30 years ago when they did a rewrite is still sitting there today. But every so often, there will be amendments to the code. And those happen, depending on the local government, with some regularity. But the zoning code has thousands of provisions in it, and we're talking about amending a couple dozen a year at the most. The focus of this book and the Sustainable Development Code generally is really on local governments that are 150,000 people and below, which by far is the bulk of local governments in the United States. Because those are the local governments that don't necessarily have the resources to dive into a zoning rewrite or to do the research on their own. They may be worried about putting funds into libraries, police, roads, schools, all sorts of different things that local governments are responsible for. And so rethinking a zoning code is not necessarily at the top of the budgetary agenda. And so that's the other thing that this project, both the book again and the Sustainable Development Code, are really trying to help those local governments that don't have those resources.
ELI's Center for State and Local Governance actually takes a similar approach, recognizing that small and mid-sized cities that are, not on the coast are often more resource-strapped and would benefit from model language and other tools. So Linda Bregan, the program director, often likes to say that although we love Seattle, not every city is Seattle, and in fact, most cities are not.
Exactly. When you look at the Sustainable Development Code and the examples that are in this book, we try to stay away from the usual cast of characters like Portland and Seattle and San Francisco. I mean, they're doing great stuff. And sometimes that's all we could find are the things that they're doing. But it's very difficult to convince a jurisdiction of 1,000 people in rural Midwest to take a particular action on the food system when you're coming to them with, hey, look at what Seattle and Austin did. And so we try to find examples that have a diversity of geography, but also a diversity of jurisdictions. So we look for anything from 150,000, then to 50,000, then to 15,000, and to 500, and really try to hit a variety of types. Because as you know, no local government is truly the same, but the experiences and what they have in their code is often similar.
So, Jonathan, how are the different recommendations categorized in the book? And is there a particular way that we should be thinking about these different types of amendments?
Yes, there's a couple ways that we categorize development codes and the food system. The first way is looking at the food system itself and trying to think about what aspects of the food system can a zoning code or development code implicate or impact. And there's really 4 areas that we focus on in the book, and then we list the recommendations under them. And they are, number 1, on-site productivity. So how can we enhance the productivity on an individual's land? What can we do in terms of the zoning code to remove barriers to increase productivity? And so we were talking about bees before. And so that's an example where we would look in the code and remove a barrier on allowing people to keep bees. Number 2, increasing on-site commercial activity, allowing people to actually sell on their site. And so here we're looking at things like allowing farmers markets, temporary farm stands, allowing people to have the opportunity to have a commercial activity on a residential property. Number 3, now we're looking off-site, and that is to increase off-site access to nutritious food. This is really addressing that food swamp, food desert area. And so here we're looking at things like how do we increase grocery store developments in recognized food swamps, or limiting the development of dollar stores. And then finally, looking at protecting local agricultural land. In the United States, we lose an enormous amount of acres of agricultural land each year. And that is lost to a number of different things. One of them is development. And so looking at how we can increase development for purposes of housing needs while also not losing that core agricultural land so that the agricultural development can be utilized by the local community. So that's 4 different ways that we categorize the recommendations that are in the book. I just want to mention one other way in which we categorize things in the book. So that first one is looking at the food system. The other way that we categorize them is looking at the development code. So what are the tools that the development code can look at for purposes of food security and sovereignty? So instead of things like producing food, producing commercial activity around that food, here we're talking more about what the development code and zoning code itself can do. And so here we have 3 different ways to view that. Number 1, remove barriers. So what in the existing code is stopping a community from increasing food security and sovereignty? Number 2, how do we create incentives? So creating incentives, encouraging homeowners, developers to increase food production. And then number 3, fill regulatory gaps. Where will we draw an absolute minimum in terms of increasing food security and sovereignty.
Say that a city were to adopt some of the recommendations you just mentioned. What would improvement look like?
So let's talk about removing barriers for a moment. So removing barriers around bees, meaning allowing bees, removing barriers around fowl, chicken, removing barriers around front yard gardens. Many jurisdictions and homeowners associations prohibit front yard gardens. So allowing those gardens to flourish, having all sorts of trees. Many jurisdictions prohibit fruit trees. So thinking about removing all those barriers and allowing all this production to happen on site, but then also allowing people to set up a temporary food stand so that your neighbors can come over and, hey, I'm growing tomatoes. Well, that's awesome. I'm growing basil. Well, fantastic. Let's get some caprese salad together, and starting to make connections among neighbors, thinking about instead of development in a way that is isolating. You probably are familiar with this book, Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, right? This idea that we have been further separating. Development is a key aspect of that, where we are separating residential from commercial, but also that residential is separating from other residents, right? It's like a walled off community, and thinking about breaking down those barriers and creating a world where the food system is easily accessible. It's right there. It doesn't have to travel all these ways. So, part of this ideal community then is being able to access food in a very quick way. And I'll just give one other example. Many of your listeners probably contribute to or participate in a CSA, community supported agriculture, where you get these shares and you go out there. Well, one of the CSAs that we were part of allowed you to go out there and glean your own food. It was wonderful. It's a whole nother experience to be able to drive 3 miles or maybe bike 3 miles and glean your own food and see where it comes from and experience that. It's a level of appreciation that I think most Americans don't have.
I would love to live in the society that you're describing.
What I think is important about that is that that experience that people are born into is something that it oftentimes is not chosen. This is something that land use laws have put in motion for decades. And that is the world and the development that we live in. And we're stuck with it unless we change the laws. It's not something that existed organically or as a matter of natural law, right? This is something that we as humans chose, and we could certainly change it.
You have all these great recommendations, and I'm sure the challenge now is how to actually implement them. So how are you working towards implementation?
It's a huge undertaking, and we are toying around with some stuff. For example, the current project that we have in motion comes from a grant from the Gates Family Foundation in Colorado. It's a fantastic institution, and we're working with them to provide something called the Sustainable Development Code Challenge, where we're putting out an RFP to local communities in Colorado to say, what is your challenge, your biggest challenges that you're facing around sustainability in your development code? They're going to send in their challenges to us, and we're going to do an evaluation of their code based on those issues to help them begin that implementation process. But the challenging part with implementation is that working with a single jurisdiction doesn't necessarily in and of itself get replicated elsewhere. And so we're trying to figure out ways to do that. And so we're toying with joining up a bunch of different localities that are wrestling with the same issue and have a series of workshops around implementation. And so that a group of local communities can work through the implementation process together.
To close out our episode, a lot of our listeners are lawyers and in the legal field. How can they help support these efforts?
We've had dozens of lawyers volunteer at the Sustainable Development Code and be involved with the development of the recommendations in this book. That is a huge part of this, but also just explaining how this could work, like working with people in your community to say, this is what the development code currently states. It currently prohibits us from doing hydroponics in our jurisdiction, or again, bees. Let's talk about how we can amend that. Lawyers generally are a huge aspect to developing their own community. The other thing that lawyers can do is they can reach out to me at the Sustainable Development Code And if they're interested, we would love to have them participate in putting together the recommendations we have, or the implementation portion, and having lawyers work on that part would be a huge benefit to communities around the country.
Thanks again, Jonathan, for taking the time to be here and to speak about your book. For our listeners, I recommend that you check out Remarkable Cities and the Security and Sovereignty of Food and Nutrition.
It was my pleasure. And as always, a pleasure to work with ELI, both on the book and on this podcast. So thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.